Hello, I'm Gavin Hoey and you're watching another episode of Creative Lightroom. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to create a vintage style picture inside a Lightroom 5. Now, vintage images. There are so many ways that you can make your images look vintage inside of Lightroom, and this is just one of those ways, but it's one of my favourite. Now, it works really well with any image, but of course if you've got a vintage style image, then this technique is going to lend itself beautifully to those older style vintage photos. So let's jump into Lightroom and see how it's done. So here in Lightroom 5, I'm actually going to start not on the usual basic panel here, I'm actually going to start on split toning. Now if you go back a few episodes, you'll see that we did some split toning to make a black and white split toned image. But in this case, I'm going to do it on the color image. But the technique is largely the same. Start with the highlights and start with saturation, and I'm really going to punch that up quite high. And then I'm going to move the hue for highlights until it's around about 50, thereabouts. This is one of those techniques where you don't have to be exact. Then I'm going to come down to the shadows, and again, I'm going to punch them up really high as far as saturation goes, but for hue, well, normally I would add 180 to 50, making 230, but I'm actually going to go a little bit more or a little bit less. It's entirely up to you. And don't be afraid to tweak these settings. They're not set in stone. So if you want to go 60 and then 250, it's fine. It's all good. You can choose it, and every time you do it, it'll be a little bit different, and that's part of the beauty of this technique. Okay, so that's added in some split tone color to our color image. Now we're going to change the contrast by going to tone curve. So here on tone curve, I'm on the linear tone curve, I'm on the RGB combined tone curve. And all I'm going to do is come to the bottom left corner, and this affects the shadows in the picture. I'm going to click and drag up and across. And that will affect the shadows, and you can see how I'm affecting the shadows by moving that slider around, and we're going to pop it around about there somewhere. Then I'm going to go to the opposite side to the highlights, and I'm going to click on the highlights and come down and in, and you can see how that affects the highlights. Now it's perfectly okay to get this wrong, to think, well, I get to the end of this and it's not quite what I want. That's fine. It's one of those techniques that evolves, and sometimes when you get to the end of the technique, you'll find you need to go back to the beginning or the middle point and just make some tweaks and changes. It's not a problem. Okay, so next thing to do is to jump into the basic, and we will make some basic changes here. It is a little bit flat. Well, look at the histogram and you'll see why. The tone curve change has meant that there is no shadows and there is no highlights. So let's put a little bit more contrast by adding, you guessed it, clarity. So I'm going to pop a bit of clarity in there and a bit more color as well to really punch up the colors that are there. And I'm going to go quite high with the colors. It's still clipped at either end of the histogram. That's fine. That's never going to change. Even when I come to the shadows and I increase the shadows a little bit and I pull back the highlights a little bit. Okay, so that's my picture looking pretty good. I'm happy with that. Next, what we're going to do is come down and apply two more changes, because there's two things here that just lift this from the standard kind of vintage effect to one that has a little bit more style. So my first thing is going to be on effects. Here on effects, I'm going to find the post-crop vignetting. Now normally if people do this, they tend to darken down the edges, and that works really well and is actually quite realistic, but I like to go the other way. I'm going to increase the post-crop vignetting just so we bleed away and bleach out the corners of the picture. And it's a little bit like the light leaks. If you remember the very first episode of Creative Lightroom, it's a little bit like a poor man's light leak. It works very quickly but very effectively. Last thing I'm going to do is something that you probably wouldn't expect. It's lens correction. And I'm going to go to the manual button on lens correction and find the distortion thing right at the top. Now normally we use this to remove lens distortion, but in this case I'm going to add my own, because that's what I would expect from a vintage lens. So I can drag it to the right and get some pincushion distortion, or I can go to the left and get some barrel distortion. Up to you. You can do either way, and I think that works pretty well. I'm going to go quite heavy. If you're going to do it, make it pretty obvious. So I'm going to go to about plus 50. Obviously we have these edges here, and I could crop those down, or I can get the scale slider here and just scale this up like that. Either way works fine for me. So there you go, there is my vintage image complete with lens distortion, a little bit of vignetting, and of course a slightly weird colour shift. Well, that brings us to the end of the Creative Lightroom series for this season. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, don't forget to go back and check them on my YouTube channel, or you can find them on my website, www.gavtrain.com. I'm Gavin Hoey, thanks for watching.